Growing healthy plants at home starts with selecting the healthiest plants at the nursery. So in this video, I'm going to share with you some smart shopping tips so that whenever you go to the garden center or nursery, you can pick out the best plants possible. Walk into any nursery or garden center and it's hard not to be overwhelmed by all the beauty. And it is a magnet for the impulse buy. Take it from me. So if you can possibly know what it is that you're coming to buy before you get here and where it's going into the landscape, you're doing yourself a huge favor, because undoubtedly you're going to fall in love with a few plants once you get here. And the very least that you should do at that point is learn the growing conditions of that plant. Usually there's a tag in the pot or attached to the plant that gives you a lot of important information, such as the height and maturity and the spacing between plants and the ideal growing conditions, such as sun and shade preferences and the type of soil that it prefers the most. Because if you can take that plant and put it into those ideal conditions where you live, then you're setting it up for success. On the other hand, if you try to make that plant grow where it's not ideally suited, then you're just asking for problems later. So once you find that group of plants you like, pick the best of the bunch. It's just like shopping for anything else, whether that's produce or clothes or cars. Set yourself up for success right from the start. So here we have a grouping of hydrangeas, and I'm looking at these and they all look pretty good. I'm seeing good coloration, I'm seeing nice flowers. I don't see any broken branches, but if I did, I'd probably shy away from those, or maybe ones that have a little bit of disease or potential pest issues. And this might be the one plant in the group I shy away from, but fortunately plants are very resilient and forgiving. A smart step to take when checking out your plants at the nursery is to look for pests. Now, just for the record, not all insects are pests. In fact, only about 3% are the bad guys, meaning 97% are either good or neutral. But if you don't know, you don't want to take that chance, because a lot of the pests that end up in your garden or on your plants in your house from houseplants hitchhike on the plants you bring home from the nursery. So a good way to find out if you've got too many insects on your plant, rub your hand over the top, and this is especially true with annual and perennial flowers, and look under the leaves, because a lot of insects like to hide out there too. So rub your hand over the top, check the leaves, and if you notice any insect activity and you're not sure whether they're a good guy or a bad guy, play it safe and leave those plants behind. A very important step in the plant selection process is to look at those leaves, and you're looking for discoloration or damage to the leaves. So it could be the leaves are yellowing, or they're stippling, or maybe they have brown spots or brown edges. That could come from over-fertilization, but you likely may not know exactly what the problem is, but to the extent that you can look at it and kind of figure it out, all the better. But you don't want to handicap yourself right from the start either. So if you have a selection of plants that look healthy, don't have that discoloration to the leaves, then those are the ones you want, and leave the ones with a discoloration behind. Because if the leaves are discolored, something is going wrong, whether it's too much water, too little water, like I said, pests or diseases. No point in handicapping yourself. Leave these behind and take the healthy ones. Now, if all the plants in the grouping have that same problem, it's probably best that you leave them all behind and then just seek out what you're looking for somewhere else where you don't have any of those. Now, there's another place that you can look to check the condition of the plant, and that's down in the roots. But that's going to require that you pull the plant from the container. And actually, that's going to be okay. If you do it carefully and you think you might get some dirty looks from the nursery personnel, you probably won't, as long as you're careful. But here's what you're looking for, and that is the root pattern, first of all. And I usually do this when I'm buying a shrub like this. I'm looking to see how tight this pattern is of those roots growing within the container, because if it's been in the container for too long, those roots have nowhere to go. Although they'll continue to grow, they just start forming this tight circular pattern. So the longer they're in that container, the tighter that pattern gets. And the downside is that this can become so tight that water and nutrients can't even pass into the plant. So if you were to take it home in that condition and you didn't check and you just put it in the ground, at best, this plant will just flounder in place. But worst case, and more often than not, it will die a slow death. So you want to know what the conditions of the roots are before you bring it home. So by carefully pulling it out, inspecting the roots, you'll have a good sense of what that is. Now, just because it has a tightly bound pattern, is that a death sentence? Not necessarily. A lot of times, I'll take my fingers and I'll, what I call liberate the roots, and I'll just work my fingers into the roots and loosen them up. And by doing that, you break the pattern, so when that plant gets in the ground around that native soil, it starts to grow out. But if you don't do that, those roots haven't had that pattern broken and they continue to just work in that spiraled situation. So at least liberate the roots. But if you have an option to find a root mass that isn't so tightly bound, and by the way, this is a good example, these roots are still very soft, they haven't really begun to form a tight pattern yet, this plant is in great shape. I'd be very happy with this, and yet I would still lightly break that pattern. But just be sure you check the roots before you bring a plant home and make that big investment. You don't want root patterns that are tightly bound. And one final thought. You've taken some extra steps to make sure that you have the healthiest plants possible. But once you get them home, do your best to get those planted as soon as possible. And if you can't, make sure that you store them in a good place. And that means out of direct sun, and keep them properly watered until you can get them in the ground, hopefully sooner than later. And I hope that helps.